Liz, before we jump into the Atlantic piece, which is so powerful and so pointed and poignant about your decision to ultimately resign as a member of the board of trustees for the Ford Presidential Foundation. Before we dig into that, it sounds like, based on what I've read, you developed an incredibly close relationship with President Ford, with our former First Lady, Betty Ford, and ultimately you were on the board of trustees, I believe, for decades at the Ford Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship, how it developed, and then your time as a member of the board of trustees?
I spent almost every day of his presidency with him, like all day long, like on Air Force One, in the car. At the end of work days, they would invite me to come up and have a drink with him up in the residence, and we wouldn't be talking about politics. I mean, they, for some inexplicable reason, liked having me around. And I think they liked me because I didn't have a dog in the hunt. I wasn't lobbying for anything. I was doing the job that I loved, and I just became like a trusted member of the family. When it came down to the foundation, if you look at the composition of the board now, it's a big board. I think there are like 38 trustees or something like that. But out of all of those, at this point, I believe only 5 or 6 of them actually worked in the administration. And I was, of course, one of the youngest, if not the youngest staffer in the White House. So I'm still alive to talk about it. A lot of them aren't. Henry Kissinger's gone, or they've aged out. I think they have a retirement of 80 or something like that. So most of the people on the board now really didn't know President Ford that well. They didn't work for him. I really don't think a lot of them understood him or what he was all about. I mean, they hear things, but there was one thing to hear him, another thing to experience it. And the issue was the annual Gerald R. Ford Presidential Medal for Public Service. And it's about people who really do well. And there's a whole list of criteria.
Let me read the criteria
Oh, go
because
ahead. Yeah, sure.
you lay that out in the article. You
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that, and I assume this is an annual award that they give, the
Yes, it
foundation
is.
gives.
And
The
I,
Gerald F. Ford Medal for Distinguished Public Service is given to leaders who have demonstrated strength of character, integrity, trustworthiness, fidelity to principles in decision making, sound judgment, decisiveness, determination in the face of adversity, diligence, self confidence, balanced with respect for the views of others, and self discipline in personal life. And you had a particular nominee in mind to be awarded this prestigious medal.
I did. And in fact, her father had received the medal in 2004. Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, whom I got to know as the Chief of Staff for President Ford, first deputy, then the chief. I probably spent more time with Cheney than anybody, including the president. And so his daughter, Liz, whom you've all probably heard about, is a lawyer. Went to U Chicago, by the way, where my youngest son is presently getting a PhD, and is a kid I've known since she was 8 years old. Later on, as when she became an adult, I've spent a lot of time with her and her family and taking pictures of them and just hung out with them. Liz Cheney is one of the most courageous people in American politics. Period. I don't care. You can't name someone with more guts and integrity than her on either side of the aisle. And as a trustee, I could nominate somebody. I wasn't on the nominating committee, so we would give them our nomination. They would look at them and then forward them to the executive committee of 12 people who would make this ultimate decision. And I strongly recommended Liz. I wrote about it, and for all the reasons. And I said, I don't think there's another choice. I mean, she is on our board, for one thing. Her dad is now an emeritus, but was on the board since the beginning of the foundation. I said, this has nothing to do with her dad. And this is not about medals as much as it's about this is honoring Liz Cheney. She has done things that President Ford is all about. She almost channels his integrity and his courage and his strength. So the first time around, they ended up not doing it. And I wasn't exactly sure why. There had been some conversation about, well, they were worried about if Trump became president, weaponizing the IRS the way Nixon did, and because they're a nonprofit, there are certain rules governing that, and that it was just a bunch of BS to me. They had a former president. I don't think his name's ever come up, but he passed on it after a couple of months and actually made the process more difficult. They then offered it to somebody else who I think for scheduling reasons couldn't do it. And at that point, I hadn't quit. But then when the door opened for the third time, I said, look, you are making a mistake. This is the person, you've got to do this. I mean, she is the person who has to get this medal. I mean, you have to step up in the name of President Ford and say what she's doing is helping save democracy. And so they once again passed, and they selected Mitch Daniels, who's not a bad guy, but that being not a bad guy is not on that list of things you just wrote about. And plus, he has disagreed, with Trump, but he hasn't really spoken out about it, other than to say he agreed with some things that Biden's done, and that earned him a vicious tweet from Trump Jr., just the very fact that he would say something agreeing with Biden on. And so I decided right then and there, I don't want to be a part of this group anymore. And I didn't threaten them. I didn't say, if you don't give her the medal, it wasn't a matter of pique. It was a matter of they are dishonoring the reputation of Gerald R. Ford by not doing it. And so I wrote that letter, and that was that.
Yeah, and you had some very direct and pointed comments in your letter of resignation. Let me just read one passage that you wrote. You asked rhetorically, did Lieutenant Gerald Ford, when he was in the Navy, did Lieutenant Gerald Ford meet the enemy head on because he thought he wouldn't get killed? No, he did it despite that possibility. This executive committee, on the other hand, bolted before any shots were fired. I mistakenly thought we were better than that. Those of you who rejected Liz Cheney joined many, quote, good Republicans now aiding and abetting our 45th president by ignoring the genuine menace he presents to our country. And when I read words like that, David, first of all, I agree with every letter of every word. And in my afterlife, having retired from first service as an active duty Army JAG, prosecuting court-martial cases, and then nearly quarter of a century with the Department of Justice, I read those words, and that is what I and we here at Justice Matters have dedicated ourselves to, is fighting what we see as an aspiring dictator, right? An aspiring autocrat who really wants to bring an end to our democracy. That would sound hyperbolic in other times, but it's not. So I appreciate when you so directly and strongly kind of call out what you see as this sort of cowardice. So let me ask you this question, David. I ask a lot of people, how is it that there can only be two in today's Republican Party, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who have decided our democracy is more important than their job? As I said in the introduction, you've photographed every president from Lyndon Johnson through the present. You have been around presidents and you've been around power. What's your perception of how there can only be two in today's Republican Party who are willing to stand up to Donald Trump?
A four-letter word that begins with F, fear.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Liz also is, I mean, she has had death threats, but she marches on. Really, she's one of the bravest people I know. Also has a great sense of humor. She doesn't take herself that seriously, which is those are the kind of people I like. And Gerald Ford was the same way. He could make fun of himself in the always falling down the stairs. I mean, which he didn't, but he had bad knees, And so those kind of things stick with you. Shoot one dog, and for the rest of your life, you got to live with it. But anyway, I don't know what that is. That was the point of the letter. Like all those people. I mean, I on the executive committee, the people who made this decision 3 times not to give it to her, only one of them had worked for Ford. The rest of them, no. And for all I know, some of them are Trump supporters. I don't know that one way or another, but I think they live in fear of the guy. And I wrote that look at this pathetic person sitting in a New York courtroom confronting the woman that he had an affair with, who he said he didn't have an affair with, and paid her off not to talk about it. How can you consider that guy to be the president of the United States? I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, I know that. But it's astonishing. And it always goes back to President Ford and like the kind of people that Ford was, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. I'm a no political party person. I'm not campaigning for anybody. I'm astonished. And I think Gerald Ford, the way he lived his life, the way he looked at other people with kindness and with empathy, none of that exists with Donald Trump. And so everybody knows it. And yet all these people are there, the core supporters, whatever you call them. And I grew up with people like that in Roseburg, Oregon. It was like they still are. It's like Trump country where I grew up today. It's a very conservative part of the state. And Oregon is considered a Democrat state, but mainly because the main population, the biggest population is around Portland, and they're mainly Democratic people. And so it's not a surprise to me because I know who they are. I've probably defriended almost anybody I knew in Roseburg because they kept harassing me with their Trump bullshit. And so I don't know what to say. Adam Kinzinger, Liz, there are a lot of others too, but the point was for the quiet Republicans who actually, and I mentioned that these people who rail against Trump behind closed doors, and then when they go out, they don't say anything, which is just as bad as supporting the guy, as far as I'm concerned.
So let me just ask you as kind of a wrap up to this. After decades on the board of trustees of the Ford Foundation, was it a difficult decision for you to resign?
No, no, it was not difficult. It was painful because there are a lot of people on the foundation who agreed with me. I got a lot of feedback from people, some of whom had worked for Ford, 100% agreed with me. I didn't do it lightly. It wasn't a whimsical thing. I really thought about it. My wife could tell you that I wasn't agonizing about it, but I just like, how am I going to go about it? And when I ended up writing that letter, I sent it to every single trustee because I had everybody's email. So it all went out at the same time. Liz Cheney, who was on the board, found out about it when everybody else did. And so that was that. I think the other part of it that bugged me was the response. Gleaves Whitney, who's the executive director, I mean, even the president of the foundation or chairman of the foundation wouldn't speak up on his own behalf. But they were talking about that IRS rule. And I had a lawyer look at it, and he sent that out. Their rationale was that, well, we can't do this because of we can't appear to be giving support one way or another or against to a candidate. Liz was not a candidate. Double, triple underscore. She was not a candidate. They said, well, there was talk of her thinking about running. I mean, there are 100 US senators who look in the mirror every day and they see a future president. They're all thinking about it. Does that mean they should be disqualified from getting an award? And so it was pathetic. That response was pathetic. And they said upon legal advice, well, they should get another lawyer then, because any lawyer, and I talked to a couple of them, so what does that mean? That means being a declared candidate is like a legal thing, like you're declaring your candidacy, you got to go and start playing by different rules. She didn't do it. Yeah, she was thinking about it, but so what?
I want to say thank you to you for writing not only the piece in the Atlantic, but that letter of resignation. There's a link in the Atlantic piece where people can go and read that letter as well. I will put a link in the description of this video to the Atlantic piece, and I urge everybody to read it, because that is what everybody who cares about the future of our democracy needs to be yelling about from the rooftops, and making sure you get out the vote, helping people register, helping people get to the polls. Whoever you're going to vote for, please just get out and vote, because I know we always say this is the most important election of our lifetime, but I'm hard pressed to say that that's not true this time around, when you have someone who has said, and I quote, "I will be a dictator on day one." How we've reached this point in the United States of America, I don't know, but I think it's our obligation to preserve our democracy for our children, our grandchildren, and everybody's children and grandchildren. So thank you for your body of work, and thank you for your voice in that Atlantic piece and taking a stand, and also for sitting down and talking with us this morning, David. I so greatly appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. This was fun.